O, tēnā rau atu tātou. Kua huitahi nei, mo tēnei kaupapa nui whakahirahira, he kaupapa hāpai tangata, he kaupapa hiki wairua hoki. Me mihi ka tika ki ngā hau kāinga, ngā ahika o tēnei rohe. Koutou ngā iwi o Ngambri, o Ngunnawal, ka nui te mihi kia koutou, ki tō koutou rangatira tanga, ake ake. I roto i te whakaaro aroha, ka tuku hoki ngā mihi kia koutou o Lime, mai i tō koutou tīmatatanga, taino ki tēnei huihuinga. Kia Lelon, kia Shane, thank you for convincing me to come and present this keynote. But much more than that, thank you and the whole team for the incredible work you have done to create this generous, warm and collegial event. And thank you to all of you who have stayed. I was born and raised in Whangarei, it's a smallish town about 2.5 hours north of Auckland. And I'm from a local hapu in that area called Ngāti Hau. So I think I've got a wind thing happening in addition to my name. My marae is whakapara. My papakainga is on the Whangaruru Harbour, on the east coast, on whenua named Poike. My iwi are Ngāti Wai, Ngāti Hau and Ngāpuhi. Let's clear this up. I am not a medical educator. I've come from education and not the usual route either of primary or secondary teaching. I've rather been involved in different educational settings for all of my life, from establishing community-based wānanga reo, teaching Māori to adult learners of Māori, to a kohanga reo in central Auckland, it's a Māori medium preschool, to establishing and developing Māori medium primary and secondary options, and as an academic at Auckland University for the past 20 years. I realise on reflection, I've concentrated my activism and organising work in really local settings, in communities in which I've been embedded and obligated to. And most of the time that work has been more important to me than academic research. The only empirical human participants data gathering study I've ever done was telling the story of a school that I've been a part of for 20 years because it felt like it was actually my story to tell. I told the story of the treaty-based co-governance arrangements we established there back in 2001, and the story too of the relational, face-to-face, day-to-day work of sustaining a positive school culture grown mostly from Māori knowledges and cultural practice. This work likely led me as an adult student and solo mother into the university to do an arts degree and into the field of Māori education and to Kaupapa Māori, both disciplines or area of study that had literally just been created by people that you all know, like Linda and Graham Smith and others. This university I'm in has become another community in sight of change. I've led the School of Māori Indigenous Education, the Faculty of Education and Social Work. I've been the tumu or Deputy Dean of the faculty, and now in my role as PVC Māori. Like the school and community settings, I feel like I'm just here working to change our institution for Māori, which is in the end to improve it for all of us. And we're working with that idea of indigenisation, which we can be critical of, and there's other words we can use, and no doubt in 5 years' time we will be using different words. But in each of these settings, I've had the privilege and the pleasure of working with and learning from Māori children and students and communities and colleagues and educators. And inevitably, like most of us, a large part of working in these spaces and in these roles involves educating non-Māori students, colleagues and university leaders. My talk today, I hope, is a critically positive one. In the context of our increasingly polarised worlds, let's here think of the New Zealand election and the vote here as examples. I'm making a positive plug for strengthening our decolonising and indigenising work in ways that draw from our own Indigenous political knowledges, logics and practices, those special powers of ours we sometimes overlook. Actually, we use these Indigenous powers every day. I've witnessed that in the days we've spent together this week. But I also know that we are the inheritors of some entrenched, to borrow from Eve, theories of change, theories, assumptions and beliefs about power, identity and relationships that have shaped our political analysis and practice for a few generations now. These ideas have served us and still serve us in making important rights claims, gaining forms of recognition and accompanying resources. But sometimes, I'm going to argue today, these ideas have the effect of training our attention too fully on the coloniser and on ever more sophisticated critiques of coloniality, and in ways that hold our attention in those binary logics, and that can divert our attention away from our own considerable Indigenous powers and the profound effects of these too. More on that soon. So I intentionally draw out these two broad approaches to change that are both at work in our worlds. One is rooted in critical and structuralist traditions of change, which we see dominantly in research framings and analysis, and the other that is more present in the continuity of Indigenous Māori ways of doing the political. I want to start by, let's hope I get this right, sharing a kupu whakaari, or a prophecy, from the tribal group Ngāti Whātua, on whose lands I live and on whose lands the University of Auckland resides in Tāmaki Makaurau. I share this because it explains quite a lot about the Māori political philosophy, and practice. It's an example of forms of mātauranga, knowledge, Māori ontologies and epistemologies that can teach us so much about doing the political Māori styles. The kupu whakaari is attributed to Ngāti Whātua Matakite or Sia Titahi. In the years leading up to the signing of Te Tiriti o Waitangi in 1840, Ngāti Whātua were meeting to consider how to position themselves in relation to the dangers and opportunities that the influx of settlers represented. If you know Auckland, you know it's a narrow but very fertile isthmus, which was coveted by many, which is why it's called Tāmaki Makaurau, coveted by many, many lovers. So this place often resulted in skirmishes by neighbouring tribes, including my own. During this meeting, Titahi fell into a trance and received a message that was both a warning to his people of looming danger, but also a vision of how those challenges might be met and transformed into opportunities for the people. The prophecy says, "He aha te hau e wawara mai he tiu he raki. Nāna ia mai te pupu tarakihi ki uta e tiki nātu e au te kōtui. Ko ia te pauwhakairo katu ki Waitemata I oku wairangi e." And you can see the English translation there. What is this wind that softly murmurs? It's the breeze of the northwest, the north, that drives on our shore the Nautilus shell. If I bring from the north the handsome carved post and place it here in Waitemata, my dream will then be fulfilled. The wind blowing from the north refers to the presence of Governor Hobson in the Bay of Islands, representing the British Crown, where Te Tiriti was first signed and where much of the political and economic activity at that time was centred. The only time a Nautilus shell would wash up upon the shore in the Waitemata harbour is after a storm. The storm here is attributed to the upheaval of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the rapid changes at work in Aotearoa. pou whakairo, carved posts, are erected by Māori to signify mana whenua, or power and authority belonging to and over the land. Led by the tribal leader, here's Auckland, taku aroha. Led by the tribal leader Apihai Te Kawahau, Ngāti Whātua signed Te Tiriti on September 18, 1840 in Manukau, and did so to strategically strengthen relationships between themselves and Pākehā, or European settlers and leaders, and to provide further security to their region from attacking tribes. The pou whakairo talked about here refers not just to Ngāti Whātua's authority in the region, but to the bringing from the north of another kind of pou, a flagstaff in fact, which was erected in Auckland and flew the Union Jack on the day Ngāti Whātua signed the treaty in 1840. Apihai Te Kawahau achieved Titahi's prophecy by bringing Governor Hobson and the centre of British political activity, the capital, to the Auckland region. And as you all know, Auckland is now the biggest city and the economic engine of our country. To this end, Apihai Te Kawahau gifted 3,000 acres to Governor Hobson for the establishment of Auckland, inviting settlers to share the land with them and continue to protect Auckland and settlers from attack. By 1850, most of the usable land in Auckland was alienated to Europeans. Te Kawahau had always made it clear that the 700-acre Orake block, the papakainga of Ngāti Whātua hapu, was never to be sold. It was to be reserved in tribal ownership for Ngāti Whātua Orake forever. But by 1854, only 14 years after the initial gift, it was all the land the hapu had left. Orake was their last stand. The workings of the Māori Land Court, Public Works Act and other compulsory acquisition legislation for European settlement, eviction of people for the purposes of parks and in order for the Queen to drive by in 1952, I think it was. Sewer outlets, illegal subdivisions, the list goes on. All of this reducing Ngāti Whātua to a cluster of homes on their ancestral lands. And while they were down in the bay, or Kahu Bay, when the Queen was coming to visit, it was decided that their settlement was too unsightly and they needed to be moved up the hill out of sight. And so where they were moved to, which was their tribal lands, they call Boot Hill. Some might say, given the way Te Kawahau's invitation turned out, that Ngāti Whātua, along with all the other hapu and iwi who invited Pākehā to settle among them through Te Tiriti, were duped. That we are and were hapless victims of colonisation who at best were delusional about the possibility of mutually beneficial relationships with settlers and the Crown. The fact of colonisation and Māori marginalisation is indisputable. Māori invited a relationship with the outside world, with Pākehā settlers, the British Crown and successive governors, and that relationship was nearly always refused. It was not within colonial logics and agendas for Māori to benefit from European settlement, and they did get very annoyed when for at least the first 30 years post the treaty, we did benefit. Does this refusal of relationship mean that Māori should abandon or forget about our political principles and practices? Should we consider them naive, outmoded, no longer fit for purpose in negotiating our contemporary worlds? I don't think any of us would agree with that. The Ngāti Whātua story and prophecy is rich in what it can tell us about our understandings and practices of power and political relations. It, to me, is a story of audacious, bold, and strategic agency in the face of unprecedented change. It's a story about utilising Māori social and political logics and practices in changing circumstances, and in new and novel ways, to weave Pākehā settlers into our worlds and into cycles of obligation for peace and sustainability and stability, and for the benefits that might bring, economic, technological, and so on, to the people. It's a story of pragmatism, of entrepreneurship, of trying to solve some old problems, like fighting with my tribe, and curating the openings of new possibilities at the same time. It's a story that indicates Māori accepted a plurality of coexisting authorities. We are tribal after all including adding another one, Pākehā, who couldn't be more ontologically further from us. It's a story about our preparedness to risk cultural alteration through encounter and relationship, while also working for continued independence. And therefore it's a story that underscores relational forms of authority, practices for the sharing of social space, and for reaching forms of consensus in the interests of coexistence. It's a story that shows we did not see ourselves as victims or as less than any other group of people. We saw ourselves as equal, not the same. And it was on this basis we sought relationships with the world to augment our lives and our rangatiratanga. The title of my talk, He Hanga Hau, What Are These Winds?, riffs a little bit off Titahi's kupu whakaari, and allowed me to think a little bit more about the concept of hau, which is a concept I've returned to over and over in my life. It's very complex. And then I thought, it's kind of appropriate for a conference like this. In Māori worlds, hau is wind, but it is an animating and always relational force that underpins the health of whakapapa, of dynamic kinship systems that comprise the world. It is commonly used to refer to health, in a term you might have heard, hauora, ora meaning well, alive, and living. Hau is what underpins the systems and cycles of life and the relationships between humans and our kin, our more than human kin. Hau is traceable and visible. It shows up in the flows and exchanges of relationships, and it can tell us when systems are unwell and when restoration is sought. There are many kinds of hau, and this talk thinks about the hau, the forces that might animate our political work, by asking He Hanga Hau, what are the winds? Or in Eve's phrasing, what are our theories of change? I'm not asking for the single best answer either, as if that were at all possible, but rather for some more critical and creative attention to Indigenous approaches to doing the social and the political that have and will continue to emerge in specific contexts, places, times, and at varying scales. And the purpose of that attention is not then to fix, to codify or essentialise Indigenous practice in any programmatic way, but in every context to ask, what are the winds at work in any system, and how can they be marshalled toward hauora? So, like most of us who have spent years in this change work, struggle street we might call it, I know how deeply embedded we can be in a type of thinking we've inherited about how power works and what positions and stances are required to achieve forms of recognition in big settings and in small. A lot of our thinking about activism and social justice has been shaped, as mentioned, by what I'll broadly call the critical tradition, and specifically structuralist concepts. Structuralism generally understands forms of power and social relations in terms of underlying social and economic structures that determine social conditions and relations. The structure of the economy, law, and the state, for example, are dominated by certain interests and groups and operate to subordinate and exploit other groups. These groups, those with power and those without, are typically understood in those binary terms. Using this binary logic, critical theory has explained the basis of gender, race, and colonial power, furnishing women, Māori, and other colonised and racialised groups with identity and power categories like oppressor and oppressed, coloniser, settler, Indigenous, the list goes on. These binary oppositions rest on and reproduce a rather simplified identity politics as individuals and groups locate themselves and others within those categories. Binary forms of thinking and the assertion of fixed identities become unconscious assumptions determining what counts as political analysis and action. Such assertions can be strategically successful and politically transformative. They have achieved forms of political recognition within the dominant neoliberal economy and state institutions, and they have successfully made space for internal processes of unification, decolonisation, and cultural reclamation. As Jones and Jenkins point out, an oppositional Māori identity politics has been the basis for internal collaboration and a politics of strength. We, Māori, have created and multiplied physical and discursive spaces that did not exist before, including Māori educational institutions like Kohanga, Kura Kaupapa, and Wānanga social and tribal agencies, programs like MAPAS, conceptual approaches to social and cultural problems and priorities, methodologies, theories, even fields of research like Māori education. So critical theory and structuralist analysis provide a useful analytical frame. They name and critique one way in which power works and offer a straightforward and effective approach to political activism. Recourse to oppositional stances clearly has ongoing purchase. I'm also suggesting, though, that these structuralist analyses are quite obviously too deterministic, often asserting a simplistic view that, for instance, they, the coloniser, have all the power and we, the colonised, have none. Statements like schools or universities oppress Māori and benefit Pākehā stand in for more nuanced, radical analyses that consider both the benefits and problems of university for Māori, positive Māori education in the education sector, and so on. Structuralist analysis can also encourage simple reductionist identities that overlook the fact that people are not reducible to our social labels. We are always more than those. Such explanations often work to cast all Māori as colonised victims or all state policies as antagonistic to Māori aspirations. Māori disappear as agents with impact on social institutions. Our political gains are reduced to very little. We are patronised as victims against whom the world is aligned. Identities based on victimised embattlement can entrench our reactionary political stances. What started out as groundbreaking and radical can become a repetitive orthodoxy. Behind the lines and in the trenches, we can miss opportunities for connection and possibilities for change. One of the central problems with essentialist and oppositional identities and stances, even when they are strategically summoned in the service of us, the colonised, is that they remain within the binary logic of colonialism itself. The basic of this logic is a fixed idea of them and us in a hierarchical opposition, which I'm arguing is antithetical to Indigenous and Māori ontological approaches. Just have a sip. I forgot my phone, so I'm not sure where I'm at with time. I think I'm doing okay. Māori-settler relations, for example, have not been based on total Māori oppression. As Linda Smith has observed, there's been unevenness in the experience of colonisation across tribal groups and regions. Pockets of equality have existed between Māori and settlers that, as Jones and Jenkins suggest, represent significant Māori settler engagement, a kind of mutual assimilation. Social intimacy between these groups means that Indigenous and settler peoples within communities do not always understand or behave towards one another in politicised and oppositional terms. Further, for Māori, a relational orientation to others is evident in a long history of active engagement with the coloniser and the outside world, as I've been saying, an orientation that has continued in a myriad of ways to today. So this is not intended to be an either-or argument that we should either use binary oppositional categories or try to develop more complex Indigenous ones. Both approaches have their strengths. Some contexts require the binary approach. It is necessary to both evoke and refuse the binary. What is interesting is that while our political declarations and our research analyses stress our victimisation, most often we don't actually act like oppressed victims. We are courageous, relational and engaging. We step up and face others rather than disengage or throw things from behind colonised lines. We form relationships for mutual benefit even if the power relations are uneven. We are pragmatic. We privilege face-to-face engagement as the basis of good political relationships, which is something Eddie Jury talks a lot about in his work. In other words, our orientation is to nearly always favour risky engagement over disengagement and opposition. This relational orientation may not always work to our advantage. It is not, of course, guaranteed. Yet we do interestingly persist in it. The often positive realities of our ordinary lives show our commonplace practices of aroha, love, manaaki, care, hosting, uplifting the mana of others, whanaungatanga, relatedness. Our daily acts of power, of rangatiratanga, authority, are us actually constituting social and political space, and in Māori ways, because rangatiratanga is not some far-off future utopian place. It's lived in the day-to-day of our lives. It's not a thing, it's not a fixed state, not a constitutional point of arrival, though we might have that too, but a practice, a process, a way of being and thinking. I want to end this talk with a bit of a list of some of the ways I, and maybe we, can currently see Māori political and social knowledge and practice at work in some of our settings, some of our institutions, including the university. And in those practices, I, and maybe we, can see signs not just of hau whitia, which is failed reciprocity, that is hau that is turned aside in that exchange, or hau aitu, hau that is harmed, showing collapse and failure in relationships, but also of hauora, wellness, and hautupu, signs of life, signs of growth. Some of this list might not seem like much, and I'm not focusing particularly on structural gains here. And of course, there's a long way to go there. I'm focusing more on cultural, relational, and affective shifts that I think we tend to underestimate the value of. So, we can see Indigenous political practice as absolutely a structuralist project, keeping a firm eye on institutional change. The institutional university is to become more Māori, more permanent high-status Māori staff, more Māori students, and it teaches more Māori knowledge and more Māori ways determined by Māori. We can see and value Māori political practice through the huge shifts in the cultures of our institutions. In the mostly positive ways, students embrace our culture, their shared history with us, and their identities located in place. We also notice Māori practices in the ways in which we weave people together through narratives of relationship, of history and place. through cultural practices and tikanga, through symbols, through naming. You might know that the University of Auckland has been gifted the name Waipapa Taumata Rau by Ngāti Whātua, which is on one hand fabulous and on the other hand terrifying, because, you know, is the university going to stuff that relationship up? We can think of Māori language signage as window dressing, as we do. But it also creates a story and a set of concepts and values that we are sharing in. This supports forms of relational commitment, of obligation, friendship and solidarity. We often talk about allyship, but we don't often talk about friendship. In the Māori kind of way of thinking, it's friendship. It's beyond just those labels and social identities in which our politics flow. Our practice is observable in the increasing normalisation and valuing of mātauranga, knowledge, and tikanga in the university. And yes, there's backlash, but it continues nonetheless. And we can see it in the valuing of Māori people in our institutions everywhere. Yes, there is cultural tax. I've seen the staffing plans of our faculties, and Māori staff are absolutely at the top of the priority list for employment. We can see Māori practice at work in the ways we Māori give time to people, to relationships, and the way we show up emotionally and acknowledge and celebrate people, the living and their dead, and in the ways we create spaces and occasions that give people permission to be there, to bring and be their full, whole selves in the workplace. We can see indigenising practice in the growth of positive behaviours and discourses of our non-Māori colleagues and peers, and their increasing comfort with discomfort, and their willingness to return to the relationship even when it's difficult, and in their increasing consciousness of Māori priorities and interests in the work that they do. We can see our powers at work in the ways we're able to bridge difficult conversations and move people on from intractable, oppositional and damaging positions. We have shown them how this is possible. We have shown them what diplomacy can look like, as Ian was saying at the beginning of the week, how to create the ground for engagement and debate that doesn't result in hate, where further conversations are possible. We can see it when, instead of discourses of inclusion, we're now talking about indigenisation and decolonisation, indigenising our universities rather than simply seeking parity of outcome. And even though we might get sick of the tangas, so that's manaakitanga, whanaungatanga, these are big concepts that are used in every institution across New Zealand. We do get sick of them because they're often adopted in shallow ways and are misunderstood. But the fact of their presence opens ontological space for discussions, deep and ongoing discussions about what Māori knowledge, Māori ways of thinking and being and doing have to offer our institutions and societies. Let's acknowledge it in our people continuing to be led by our values and principles, even in the face of marginalisation and terrible social outcomes. We still express aroha and manaakitanga to others, even as we have our own important projects to progress. Let's notice all the places of innovation and creativity and Māoriness, and all the initiatives begun and carried through against all odds. Our logics are observable when our institutions are places where Māori assumptions and priorities are occasionally, but increasingly supported and resourced. We can see signs of hauora and hautupu, where people at all levels are beginning to engage with each other in ways that uplift the mana of each person and express forms of relationship and solidarity. The list goes on. I'm just going to finish with one last thought. We can see Māori social knowledge is working when koutou, so koutou means you, excluding the speaker, so you plural excluding the speaker. And when koutou is expressed by the university, it generally means you Māori, who we are helping and including in our university, our scene. So when koutou becomes this other interesting word that the Māori language has, tātou, which is we inclusive. So when we say tēnā tātou, we are acknowledging us all as a we. And it's not a we of sameness, it's not a we of assimilation, but it is a form of us. Tātou points to forms of shared identity for Māori and all members of the institution. It is achieved when we all recognise the institution as ours, because it holds and nurtures our ways of being. Tātou represents an understanding, a commitment that we are always already relations with pre-existing responsibilities to each other. An understanding of tātou supports a focus on our relational exchanges with each other. And it's in these everyday exchanges at all levels of our worlds, there are possibilities for hauora and hautapu to flow for the maximisation of life. Kia ora tātou.